Someone in this room is waiting for me to die. The thought arrived so quietly that I almost dismissed it, but once it appeared, I couldn't make it leave. The dining room of the Hawthorne estate had always been the heart of the family. The old oak table stretched nearly 20 feet beneath a crystal chandelier that had hung there longer than most of the people seated around it. Every chair was filled. Every place setting was perfect. Every smile looked rehearsed. I took my seat at the far end of the table and watched. Isabel stood beside David, pouring wine with effortless grace. She moved through the room like she belonged to every corner of it. David thanked her with a tired smile that never reached his eyes. Across from them, Eleanor sat beneath the chandelier, carefully studying her plate as if avoiding eye contact required concentration. Ethan leaned against the staircase railing near the entrance, pretending to scroll through his phone while quietly observing everyone else. Nothing seemed wrong. That was exactly what bothered me. Families argue. They interrupt each other. They tell the same stories too many times. But tonight, conversation stopped whenever I spoke. Then it restarted the moment I looked away. It felt less like a dinner and more like a performance. I noticed Victoria guiding discussions away from certain topics before they could develop. I noticed Thomas, our longtime family attorney, checking his watch more often than his food. I noticed James, the loyal butler who had worked for our family for decades, standing unusually still near the fireplace. Every time our eyes met, he looked as though he wanted to say something and then thought better of it. The strangest moment came halfway through dessert. Ethan mentioned a name. Just one name. Lily. The reaction lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Isabel's hand froze around her glass. David looked down. Eleanor's shoulders tightened. Even Thomas stopped moving. Then, just as quickly, everyone recovered and continued as if nothing had happened. Nobody explained who Lily was. Nobody asked why Ethan brought her up. The silence swallowed the name whole. I smiled and continued eating, but my attention sharpened. For 40 years, I had built companies, negotiated deals, and survived people who underestimated me. I knew what secrets looked like. They rarely announced themselves. They appeared in pauses, in glances, in conversations that ended a little too quickly. As the dinner continued, I realized something unsettling. The people around this table weren't hiding one secret. They were hiding the same secret. And for the first time in my own home, I felt like the last person who was supposed to know. The dinner ended shortly after 10 o'clock, but the feeling stayed with me long after the last plate had been cleared away. I remained seated while the others drifted toward different corners of the house. Isabel disappeared into the study with Victoria. David stepped outside onto the terrace carrying a glass he barely touched. Eleanor excused herself earlier than usual, claiming she was tired. Ethan was the only one who lingered. He stood near the staircase for a moment, looking as though he wanted to speak, then changed his mind and headed upstairs. One by one, they vanished into the shadows of the estate, leaving behind only silence. I have learned that silence can reveal more than conversation. The Hawthorne estate had never felt empty to me before. Even on quiet nights, the old house seemed alive. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked every passing minute. The fireplace settled with soft cracks. The wind moved through the trees beyond the tall windows. Those sounds were familiar, comforting. Tonight, they felt different, as if the house itself was listening. I walked slowly through the first floor, passing framed photographs that documented decades of family history. Weddings, birthdays, graduations, charity events, smiling faces frozen in time. I stopped in front of a photograph taken nearly 15 years earlier. David stood beside me, younger and confident. Eleanor was smiling. Victoria looked proud. Even Isabel seemed relaxed. Looking at it now, I wondered when things had changed. More importantly, I wondered why I had not noticed sooner. As I turned away, I caught movement near the kitchen entrance. It was James. He froze the instant. He realized I had seen him. For a brief second, neither of us spoke. Then he offered a polite nod and continued on his way. Yet something about the exchange stayed with me. James had worked for our family for more than 30 years. He knew every room, every secret passage, every celebration, and every disappointment. If something was wrong inside this family, there was a good chance he had seen it. Later that night, sleep refused to come. Around midnight, I stepped into the library and poured myself a cup of coffee. As I sat beside the window overlooking the grounds, I noticed a faint light in the distance. The study. Someone was still awake. I could not make out faces from where I sat, but I could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains. More than one person, more than one conversation. At that hour, on that particular night, it felt less like coincidence and more like preparation. I watched the light for several minutes before it finally disappeared. Then I looked out across the dark lawn and admitted something I had been resisting since dinner. Whatever secret connected Lily to the people I trusted most, it was already changing the family. The only question left was how far it reached. The following morning, the estate appeared unchanged. Sunlight poured through the tall windows. Staff moved through their routines. Coffee was served at precisely 7 o'clock. From the outside, everything looked exactly as it had for years. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was walking through a carefully maintained illusion. During breakfast, I noticed David arrive nearly 30 minutes late. He apologized, but his explanation sounded practiced, as though he had already repeated it to someone else. Isabel answered questions for him before he could respond himself. It was a small thing. Most people would not have noticed. I did. Across the table, Ethan remained unusually quiet. Normally, he enjoyed challenging opinions and asking difficult questions. That morning, he seemed distracted. Twice I caught him looking toward Isabel. Both times he quickly looked away. After breakfast, I found him alone near the rear gardens overlooking the fountain. He appeared, surprised to see me. For a moment, I thought he might leave. Instead, he stayed where he was. We spoke about ordinary things at first. The weather, his work, a recent trip. The conversation drifted naturally, but there was tension underneath every word. Finally, I asked a simple question. Who is Lily? The change in his expression was immediate. Not fear, not guilt, recognition. He looked down at the stone path before answering. I think that is a question a lot of people in this family do not want you asking. Then he stopped. No explanation, no details, just that one sentence. Before I could press further, he checked his phone and excused himself. I watched him walk away, carrying the same burdened look I had seen on David's face the night before. Later that afternoon, I went into the West Wing library to clear my thoughts. The room had always been my refuge. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes stretched from floor to ceiling. Generations of family history sat preserved behind glass and polished wood. While searching for an old business journal, I noticed something odd. A section of files in a cabinet near the fireplace had been reorganized. At first glance, nothing seemed missing. Then I realized several family records had been moved entirely. Their labels remained, but the documents themselves were gone. I stood there for several minutes staring at the empty spaces. People do not remove records unless they believe those records matter. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the estate, one thought settled firmly into place. Ethan knew part of the truth. Someone had altered or hidden information, and whatever connected those missing records to Lily had been carefully concealed long before I started asking questions. That night, I stopped looking at people and started paying attention to patterns. People can lie. Habits rarely do. Over the next several days, I watched the rhythm of the estate with greater care than anyone realized. Isabel seemed to be everywhere at once. She appeared during conversations she had no reason to join. She redirected discussions with effortless precision. Whenever a subject drifted toward family history, legal matters, or old records, she gently guided it somewhere safer. Most people would have called it social skill. I called it control. Yet something about her behavior felt too obvious. If she were truly hiding something, why make herself so visible? The question stayed with me. One afternoon, I found myself reviewing old family photographs in a sitting room overlooking the east lawn. Decades of memories sat arranged in leather albums. Weddings, anniversaries, holiday gatherings. Faces changed. Hairstyles changed. The estate itself hardly changed at all. As I turned the pages, I noticed something unexpected. Lily appeared in several photographs from years ago. Not many, just enough to stand out once I knew her name. In one image, she stood near Eleanor during a charity luncheon. In another, she appeared in the background of a summer gathering by the lake. She was not a stranger to this family. She had been around for years. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why had nobody mentioned her? Why did the room go silent when Ethan spoke her name? Later that evening, I crossed paths with Eleanor in the conservatory. Rain tapped softly against the glass ceiling overhead. She was reading but had not turned a page in several minutes. I sat beside her and casually mentioned finding old photographs. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the book. For a moment, she seemed older than I had ever seen her. "Some memories are better left where they belong," she said quietly. Then she stood and left before I could respond. I remained there long after she was gone. Outside, the rain continued falling across the gardens. Inside, another piece of the puzzle settled into place. Eleanor was protecting something. Not for herself, for someone else. The realization changed everything. Until then, I had assumed the secret revolved around money, inheritance, or influence. Now I began to suspect it reached much deeper than that. Somewhere within the history of this family was a truth powerful enough to make intelligent people avoid eye contact, remove records, and pretend certain names had never existed at all. 2 days later, the answer came. From the last person I expected. James found me alone in the library shortly before sunset. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of an antique clock mounted above the fireplace. He closed the door behind him, something he had never done without a reason. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. James had always been careful with his words. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. Finally, he looked toward the hallway to make certain we were alone. "There are things happening in this house that do not make sense anymore," he said. It was not a confession. It was an invitation. I remained silent and let him continue. He told me that over the past year, certain files had been requested repeatedly from storage. Not business records, family records, old correspondence, legal documents, historical archives. The requests always came through proper channels, yet something felt unusual about them. When the documents were returned, some arrived in a different order. Others appeared incomplete. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make an observant person uncomfortable. Then James mentioned something that immediately captured my attention. Several months earlier, he had seen Thomas arrive at the estate late one evening. The family attorney had gone directly to the study. Isabel was already there. So was Victoria. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. No one discussed it afterward. No one acknowledged it had happened. On its own, the information proved nothing. Combined with everything else, it became difficult to ignore. I asked James whether he had ever heard Lily's name mentioned. The question seemed to surprise him. He hesitated. Then he nodded once. "Years ago," he said quietly. "Not recently, but I remember the name." Before I could ask more, his expression changed. Footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the library door. Instantly, the conversation ended. James straightened his jacket and returned to his usual professional demeanor. By the time the door opened, he looked like a man discussing household schedules. Isabel entered carrying a folder. Her smile was flawless. Her tone was warm. Yet when she noticed James standing beside me, something flickered. Behind her eyes. It lasted less than a second. Most people would never have seen it. I did. That brief reaction told me more than any explanation could have. Someone was becoming nervous. As evening settled over the estate, I sat alone and reviewed every piece of information collected so far. Missing records, hidden meetings, unanswered questions, nervous glances. For the first time, I felt certain of one thing. The secret was no longer buried. It was beginning to surface, and the people protecting it could feel the ground shifting beneath them. The breakthrough arrived from an unexpected direction. 3 mornings after my conversation with James, Ethan appeared at my office door carrying a look I had never seen before. He was not nervous. He was determined. Without saying a word, he closed the door behind him and placed a small stack of papers on my desk. "I think someone has been cleaning up the past," he said. I studied the documents carefully. They were copies of visitor logs, archived event records, and property access reports gathered from different years. None of them seemed important on their own. Together, they told a different story. Lily's name appeared repeatedly over the course of nearly a decade. Charity events, family gatherings, holiday functions. She had been connected to the estate far longer than anyone had admitted. Yet around 6 years earlier, her name simply stopped appearing. It was as though she had vanished from the official history of the family. "That does not happen by accident," Ethan said. I agreed. People disappear from records only when someone wants them forgotten. What concerned me even more was a second pattern hidden inside the paperwork. Several documents referenced files that no longer existed. File numbers remained. Cross-references remained. The actual records were gone. Someone had removed pieces of a larger story while leaving enough evidence behind to reveal that something had once been there. The omission itself had become evidence, Ethan pointed toward one entry in particular. The missing file had been accessed shortly before the late-night meeting James described between Thomas, Isabel, and Victoria. The timing was impossible to ignore. After Ethan left, I remained in my office for hours reviewing every page. By evening, the sun cast long shadows across the estate grounds outside my window. The more I studied the records, the more one uncomfortable realization took shape. I had spent days treating Isabel as the center of the mystery. Yet the documents suggested something else. She was involved, certainly, but the missing records predated her influence within the family. The secret had existed long before she entered the picture. That meant someone else had started all of this years earlier. Later that night, I passed through the main hallway and noticed Eleanor standing alone beneath an old family portrait. She stared at it with an expression I could not quite read. Regret. Sorrow. Perhaps both. Before I could approach her, she quietly walked away. As I watched her disappear around the corner, a new possibility entered my mind. Maybe I had been looking at the wrong suspect from the very beginning. Over the next week, I stopped searching for evidence and started searching for motives. Evidence tells you what happened. Motives tell you why. The distinction mattered. Every clue pointed backward into the history of the family rather than forward into some new conspiracy. One afternoon, while reviewing archive correspondence in a private reading room above the library, I discovered a collection of letters that had somehow escaped removal. Most were ordinary. Holiday greetings, business notes, invitations. Then I found several references to a charitable foundation established nearly 20 years earlier. The foundation no longer existed. Its records had largely disappeared. Yet one detail caught my attention immediately. Eleanor's name appeared throughout the documents. Not as a supporter, as a founder. The discovery surprised me because Eleanor rarely sought attention and almost never discussed her past accomplishments. Curious, I continued reading. Lily's name appeared only once, buried deep within a list of volunteers connected to an early fundraising event. It was a tiny detail, easy to overlook. Yet the moment I saw it, I understood why certain records had vanished. Lily had not been removed from family history entirely. She had been disconnected from it. Someone had carefully erased the lines that linked her to the people in this house. Later that evening, I encountered Ethan near the grand staircase. He had been conducting his own quiet investigation and looked equally frustrated. When I mentioned the foundation, his expression changed instantly. I found something too, he said. He explained that several digital archives had been edited years ago. The edits were not recent. They had occurred long before anyone suspected a problem. That single fact changed everything. Isabel could not have started it. David could not have started it. Even Ethan had been a child when the records were altered. The secret originated much further back. That night, a storm rolled across the property. Rain struck the tall windows while distant thunder echoed beyond the hills. Unable to sleep, I walked through the silent corridors of the estate. As I passed the music room, I noticed a faint light beneath the door. Inside sat Eleanor alone. She was not reading. She was simply staring at an old photograph resting in her lap. For a moment, she looked exhausted by the weight of memory. Then she carefully turned the photograph face down before noticing me. Neither of us spoke. Yet in that brief silence, I became certain of one thing. Eleanor was not protecting herself. She was protecting a truth she believed would destroy someone she loved. The answer arrived through someone who was never supposed to be part of the story. Her name was Sophia, a young attorney who occasionally assisted Thomas with archival legal research. I met her by chance in a records room attached to a downtown office building owned by the family foundation years earlier. She recognized my name immediately and seemed hesitant when I introduced myself. That hesitation told me she already knew something. After a long pause, she asked a question that changed everything. Has anyone ever explained why the foundation was dissolved? I told her no. She looked down at a folder in her hands before quietly inviting me into a private conference room. What she showed me was not a scandal. It was something far more complicated. Decades earlier, the foundation had supported several community projects across the state. Eleanor had been deeply involved. So had another woman whose name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Lily's mother. Suddenly, pieces that never fit together began forming a picture. Lily was not an outsider who accidentally crossed paths with the family. Her connection stretched back an entire generation. Sophia explained that years ago a legal dispute involving inheritance rights had threatened to become public. The matter was quietly resolved, but not before creating fear among several influential people connected to the estate. No wrongdoing had been proven. No public accusations had survived. Yet the possibility of old questions resurfacing had remained. According to the records, that was the period when documents began disappearing from archives. That was when references to Lily gradually faded from official histories. Not because she had done something wrong, because people feared what others might assume if certain connections became known. As I listened, one realization overshadowed everything else. The secret had never been about money. It had never been about control. It had been about reputation. Entire branches of family history had been hidden to preserve an image. Later that evening, I returned to the estate carrying copies of several documents Sophia had legally obtained. The house felt different as I stepped through the front doors. Not because it had changed, but because I finally understood the shape of the truth concealed within its walls. As I crossed the grand hallway, I noticed Eleanor standing beneath the chandelier. For the first time since this began, she did not look away. Our eyes met across the room. There was sadness in her expression, but there was also relief. In that moment, I knew she understood something important. The secret was no longer buried in the past. It had finally found its way home. 3 nights later, I invited everyone to dinner. The message was simple. No explanations. No special occasion. Just a request that every member of the family be present. By 7 o'clock, the long oak table was filled once again. The chandelier cast warm light across polished wood. The fireplace glowed quietly in the background. Outside, the estate grounds disappeared into the darkness beyond the tall windows. Everything looked exactly as it had on the night this began. Yet nothing felt the same. Isabel sat beside David. Victoria remained composed as always. Thomas adjusted his glasses while studying the table. Ethan watched carefully from his seat. Eleanor appeared calm, though there was a weariness in her eyes that had not been there before. I allowed the usual conversation to continue for several minutes before setting down my glass. The room gradually fell silent. No one interrupted. No one asked questions. Somehow they all knew why we were there. I began with the foundation, then the missing records, then the meetings that nobody acknowledged and the names that nobody wanted spoken aloud. As I spoke, I noticed something remarkable. No one seemed shocked. They seemed relieved. Years of avoiding the truth had exhausted everyone more than the truth itself ever could. Finally, I placed several copies of the recovered documents on the table. Nobody reached for them. Nobody needed to. The evidence was no longer the point. Understanding was. Eleanor was the first to speak. Her voice was soft but steady. She explained that long ago, difficult choices had been made in the name of protecting the family. What began as a temporary decision slowly became a permanent silence. One omission led to another. One hidden detail required a second. Over time, preserving appearances became more important than preserving honesty. The room listened without interruption. When she finished, nobody argued. Nobody defended the past. Even Victoria lowered her eyes. The secret that had haunted the estate for years was finally exposed for what it truly was: fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of questions. Fear of losing a reputation carefully built across generations. Yet none of those fears had protected the family. They had only separated it. As the evening continued, conversations became more honest than any I could remember. Old assumptions disappeared. Long-avoided questions were finally answered. For the first time in years, nobody seemed interested in controlling the narrative. They were simply interested in the truth. Much later, after everyone had left the dining room, I remained alone at the table. The estate was quiet once more. I looked around the room and realized that the mystery had never changed this family. It had merely revealed what was already there. Secrets can survive for decades. They can shape lives and influence decisions. But eventually they face the same fate as every shadow. The moment light reaches them, they lose their power.